It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Princess Charlotte of Wales. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded in that closed-door meeting was not a discussion about illness or crisis in the way the public might expect, but something far more delicate, far more dangerous in its implications. Reports began to surface, carefully worded and quietly circulated, that the conversation had centered on inheritance protocols, a phrase so technical it almost seemed designed to deflect attention. Yet within the palace, those words carried weight. They pointed to legacy, to decisions made long ago, and to promises that could not be undone. Prince William, Prince of Wales, was said to have remained composed throughout, but even that composure could not hide the gravity of the moment. Palace staff were swiftly placed under strict communication lockdown, an unusual move that signaled something significant was unfolding behind the scenes. Catherine, typically poised and unshaken in public appearances, was later seen avoiding engagement, her expression controlled yet unmistakably strained. Meanwhile, William was spotted in a rare moment of vulnerability, offering quiet reassurance to Charlotte, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by those watching closely. Insiders began to whisper that this was not about health at all, that the real issue was deeply symbolic, tied to something far older than any present concern. And then came the first connection, faint but impossible to ignore, linking Charlotte to the private jewelry collection of Diana, Princess of Wales. At first, it seemed almost too improbable, too distant to be real. But as the whispers grew louder, one truth began to take shape, unsettling and profound in equal measure. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. For years, the world believed that the most iconic pieces belonging to Diana had already been accounted for, their stories told, their journeys completed. The sapphire jewels in particular had become almost mythic, symbols of elegance and emotional resonance that transcended generations. Yet behind the polished narratives presented to the public, there existed another layer of truth, one carefully preserved within the palace's most guarded records. These were not documents easily accessed or casually discussed. They were part of a private registry, a system designed not just to catalog but to protect. Within those pages, according to various interpretations, lay details of allocations that had never been publicly disclosed. It was here that the idea of a reserved heir began to emerge, a concept so subtle it had escaped attention for years. Jewelers entrusted with maintaining these pieces had long operated under strict confidentiality, their role extending beyond craftsmanship into quiet guardianship. They were not merely preserving jewelry, they were safeguarding intention. And within that intention there were hints, small but persistent, that certain items were meant for someone specific, someone whose time had not yet come. The notion that Charlotte could be central to this legacy was not immediately accepted, even within inner circles. It challenged assumptions, disrupted established narratives, and introduced a new layer of complexity to an already intricate system. Yet as more fragments of information surfaced, the possibility became harder to dismiss. There was a pattern, a consistency in the way these pieces had been handled, maintained, and referenced over time. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the realization began to take hold that this was not a recent development, but a plan set in motion long ago. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. The moment everything shifted did not come from an official statement or a carefully staged announcement. Instead, it came quietly, almost unexpectedly, from those who had long stood at the edges of the story. Trusted jewelers, bound by decades of discretion, reportedly acknowledged details that had never before been spoken aloud. Their confirmation was not dramatic, not delivered with fanfare, but it carried a weight that could not be ignored. According to sources familiar with the matter, records tied to maintenance and fitting adjustments had consistently referenced a future recipient whose identity was now becoming clear. These were not casual notes or speculative entries. They were precise, deliberate, and repeated over time. There were even suggestions that Diana herself had expressed preferences regarding a young successor, someone who would carry not just the jewelry but the meaning behind it. As this information began to circulate, the palace found itself in an increasingly difficult position. What had once been contained within a closed system was now entering the public sphere, reshaping the narrative in real time. Media insiders, always alert to shifts in tone and detail, began connecting the dots, turning whispers into headlines. And at the center of it all was Charlotte, whose quiet presence suddenly became the focus of intense attention. Her reaction, subtle and carefully managed, spoke volumes to those who knew how to read it. This was not a moment she had sought, but it was one she could not avoid. The story had moved beyond speculation. It had become something tangible, something undeniable. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Inside the palace, the reaction was immediate but controlled, a careful balance between urgency and restraint. Meetings were held, not openly but within trusted circles, where every word was measured and every implication considered. The issue was no longer just about a piece of jewelry or even a single legacy. It had become a matter of protocol, of timing, and of perception. Catherine stepped into a role that required both strength and subtlety, her focus shifting toward shielding Charlotte from the growing intensity of public interest. William, meanwhile, found himself navigating a delicate path, balancing his responsibilities as a future king with his instincts as a father. There were concerns about how this revelation might be received, about whether it would be seen as a natural continuation of tradition or as a disruption of it. Palace aides worked tirelessly behind the scenes, attempting to manage the narrative without drawing further attention to it. Yet the tension was undeniable. Small shifts in behavior, in tone, in the way certain topics were addressed, all pointed to a deeper unease. This was not a simple inheritance. It was a moment that carried emotional weight, historical significance, and potential consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. And as those within the palace grappled with these realities, one thing became increasingly clear. This was a turning point, one that could not be reversed. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. At the center of this unfolding story was Charlotte herself, a figure both central and yet almost secondary to the forces surrounding her. She had grown up within the structure of royal life, aware of its expectations but not yet fully burdened by them. Now, however, that balance was shifting. The attention she received was no longer simply the result of her position. It was tied to something deeper, something that connected her directly to Diana's enduring legacy. There were parallels being drawn, comparisons that were both flattering and overwhelming. Catherine remained a steady presence, offering guidance without imposing pressure, ensuring that Charlotte could navigate this moment with a sense of stability. William's approach was more protective, his actions reflecting a desire to shield his daughter from the harsher aspects of public scrutiny. Yet despite these efforts, the weight of expectation was beginning to take shape. The sapphire earrings, once just an artifact of the past, had become a symbol of continuity, of a story that refused to fade. And as Charlotte found herself at the center of this narrative, it became clear that this was not just about inheritance. It was about identity, about the role she would come to play in a legacy that was still evolving. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. For years, the truth had remained hidden, not out of neglect but out of intention. The decision to keep such details private was rooted in a desire to protect, to allow time and circumstance to align before revealing something so significant. There were traditions within the monarchy that dictated how and when certain legacies were passed on, and this appeared to be one of them. Charlotte's age, her readiness, and the broader context all played a role in determining the timing. There were also internal considerations, differing perspectives on whether the truth should be disclosed at all. Trusted insiders maintained their silence, understanding that their role was not to question but to preserve. Yet as circumstances changed, as external pressures mounted and internal dynamics shifted, the balance began to tip. The secrecy that had once served a purpose was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. And when the moment finally arrived, it did so not with clarity but with complexity, bringing with it questions that had no easy answers. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. What emerged from this moment was not just a revelation but a transition, a shift toward a new phase in the monarchy's ongoing story. The sapphire earrings, long associated with Diana, took on a renewed significance as they became linked to Charlotte. They were no longer simply a reminder of the past. They were a bridge to the future, a symbol of continuity that connected generations in a way that felt both natural and profound. Public reaction reflected this duality, blending fascination with a sense of inevitability. Catherine and William played key roles in shaping this transition, ensuring that it was handled with care and intention. Their approach emphasized stability, reinforcing the idea that the monarchy could adapt without losing its core identity. And as Charlotte began to step into this evolving role, it became clear that she was not just inheriting an object. She was becoming part of a narrative that extended far beyond any single moment. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's future, it was tied to a royal legacy that had been quietly protected for decades, until now. It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. In the end, what this story revealed was not just a hidden detail or a surprising connection, but the enduring nature of legacy itself. Some things, no matter how carefully they are guarded, are meant to resurface when the time is right. The connection between Diana and Charlotte became more than symbolic. It became a reflection of continuity, of the way history shapes the present and the future. The palace, initially cautious, gradually adjusted to this new reality, allowing the narrative to settle into place. Public perception shifted as well, moving from curiosity to a deeper sense of appreciation for what this moment represented. Charlotte, still young yet undeniably central to this unfolding story, stood as a quiet embodiment of that legacy. And as the echoes of the past continued to influence what lay ahead, one truth remained impossible to ignore. In the world of royalty, legacy is never simply passed down, it reveals itself, piece by piece, shaping the future in ways no one can fully predict. For years, the world believed Diana, Princess of Wales's iconic Sapphire collection, had already found its rightful place, but behind palace doors, a different story was quietly preserved, one that never made it into public record. The narrative presented to the public had always felt complete, almost too complete, as though every jewel had already fulfilled its journey, every piece assigned, every meaning settled. Yet within the inner workings of the royal system, there were layers that few ever saw, structures designed not for display but for preservation. Diana's sapphire pieces were never just ornaments, they carried emotional gravity, a connection to moments that defined not only her life but the public's memory of her. Each piece seemed to hold a story that could not be easily concluded, and perhaps that is why the official version of events always felt slightly restrained, as though something had been deliberately left unsaid. After her passing, it was widely accepted that her most treasured items had been distributed in accordance with royal expectations, passed on in a way that balanced sentiment with protocol. This belief became part of the public understanding, repeated so often it transformed into certainty. But certainty, in this case, may have been more fragile than it appeared. Behind the scenes, there existed a different mechanism entirely, one that operated quietly through private registries and sealed allocations. These were not documents meant for public consumption. They were maintained within the secure archives associated with Kensington Palace, protected by layers of discretion and tradition. Within those records, according to those familiar with their structure, were details that suggested a far more deliberate and forward-looking approach to Diana's legacy. It was not simply about distributing possessions, it was about preserving intention. Jewelers entrusted with the care of these pieces played a role far more significant than many realized. They were not only responsible for maintenance but for continuity, ensuring that each item remained ready for a future moment that had yet to arrive. Their work extended beyond craftsmanship into quiet stewardship, guided by instructions that were rarely discussed but meticulously followed. Over time, subtle patterns began to emerge within their records, references that pointed not to a completed journey but to one still unfolding. There were mentions of adjustments planned for a future wearer, notes that implied growth, change, and eventual transition. These were not accidental details. They were part of a design that suggested the story of these sapphires had never truly ended. And then there were the whispers, persistent yet elusive, about a reserved heir, a figure who had never been publicly identified but whose presence could be felt within these hidden structures. At first, such rumors were easy to dismiss, filed away as speculation or misunderstanding. But as fragments of information began to align, the idea became harder to ignore. There were early clues, subtle connections that seemed to point in one direction, linking the legacy not to the past or even the present, but to the future. And within that future, one name began to surface with quiet inevitability: Princess Charlotte of Wales. It was not a sudden revelation but a gradual realization built piece by piece from details that had always been there, waiting to be understood. What made this realization so striking was not just its implication but its consistency. Every thread, every record, every carefully maintained detail seemed to converge on the same conclusion. This was not a coincidence. It was a plan, one that had been set in motion long before it became visible. And as those long-buried records began to surface, they revealed something no one had expected: Charlotte's name had been there all along. It wasn't a royal announcement that shook the palace, it was a quiet confirmation from those who had guarded the truth for decades. And once it was spoken aloud, there was no turning back. The shift did not come with ceremony or official language, but through something far more unsettling: validation from the very custodians who were never meant to speak. For years, these individuals had operated in silence, their role defined by precision and discretion, ensuring that every piece connected to Diana, Princess of Wales, remained preserved exactly as intended. Yet now, according to insiders, that silence had been broken in the most controlled yet irreversible way. It began with subtle acknowledgments, confirmations that seemed almost routine on the surface, but carried implications that ran far deeper. Trusted royal jewelers, those long associated with maintaining these historic pieces, reportedly verified that certain sapphires had never been reassigned, never repurposed, and most importantly, never released from their original designation. What made this moment explosive was not just the confirmation itself, but the documentation that accompanied it. Records tied to maintenance schedules, design calibrations, and future fitting considerations began to surface in fragments, each one reinforcing the same narrative. These were not speculative notes or vague references. They were structured, intentional, and consistent over time. Within those records were indications that adjustments had been planned not for the present, but for a future wearer whose identity had been anticipated years in advance. There were even references, according to those familiar with the archives, to design intentions that aligned with a young successor, a phrase that now carried a weight it never had before. This was not a reinterpretation of history. It was evidence that history had been quietly preparing for something that was only now coming into focus. Inside palace circles, the reaction was immediate and deeply unsettled. Officials who had long operated under the assumption that the narrative was closed found themselves confronting a reality that felt both unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. The leak, if it could even be called that, did not originate from a single source but seemed to emerge from multiple points simultaneously, creating a sense that the truth had reached a threshold where it could no longer remain contained. Media insiders, always alert to inconsistencies and patterns, began connecting the details with increasing confidence. What had once been dismissed as speculation started to take on the shape of something far more concrete. The story was no longer fragmented. It was aligning, piece by piece, into a narrative that demanded attention. And at the center of that narrative stood Princess Charlotte of Wales. Her presence, once peripheral in this context, now became impossible to overlook. Observers noted subtle shifts in how she was perceived, how conversations around her were framed, how even the smallest gestures seemed to carry new meaning. Her reaction, though measured and composed, did not go unnoticed. There was a quiet awareness, a recognition that something significant had changed, even if its full implications were not yet publicly acknowledged. The transformation of the story from rumor to undeniable narrative was not marked by a single moment, but by the accumulation of confirmations that could no longer be dismissed. And as that realization settled in, it became clear that this was more than a revelation. It was a turning point, one that would reshape not only the understanding of Diana's legacy, but the future it was now connected to. But this revelation didn't just rewrite history, it threatened to disrupt a delicate balance within the royal family itself. As the truth rippled through palace corridors, what followed wasn't celebration but silence, strategy, and a growing tension no one could ignore. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly, not in ways that could be easily observed, but in the subtle tightening of routines, in the quiet urgency behind closed doors, and in the deliberate restraint shown by those who understood the stakes. This was no longer a matter of speculation or distant legacy. It had become immediate, pressing, and deeply sensitive. Senior royals and their most trusted advisors reportedly convened in a series of discreet discussions, each one shaped by a single question that no one could openly articulate: what happens when a long-protected truth surfaces before the institution is ready to acknowledge it? Timing became everything. Not just in terms of public disclosure, but in how the narrative might evolve if left unchecked. There were concerns about perception, about whether this revelation would be embraced as a natural continuation of tradition or interpreted as a fracture within it. Protocol, usually a steady and reliable framework, suddenly felt less certain, as though it had been designed for a different moment, a different set of circumstances. Within this growing uncertainty, behavior began to shift in ways that did not require explanation. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stepped forward with a quiet resolve, her role transforming into something more protective, more deliberate. She was no longer simply responding to events, but actively shaping how they would be experienced by those closest to her, especially Princess Charlotte of Wales. Her composure became a stabilizing force, a way of maintaining balance in a situation that threatened to tip into unpredictability. At the same time, Prince William, Prince of Wales, found himself navigating a complex intersection of duty and personal responsibility. His position demanded clarity and leadership, yet his instincts as a father pulled him toward caution and protection. This duality was not easily reconciled, and those observing closely could sense the weight of that internal conflict. It was not expressed openly, but it was present in every measured decision, in every carefully chosen response. Beneath the surface, the issue extended beyond individual roles and into the deeper structure of royal legacy itself. The idea that a symbolic inheritance could carry such significance was not new, but the way it was now unfolding introduced a level of tension that had not been anticipated. There were whispers of past decisions, of agreements and understandings that had shaped how such legacies were meant to be handled. And now, those understandings were being tested. Palace aides worked tirelessly to contain the narrative, not by denying it, but by guiding its direction, ensuring that it did not spiral beyond control. Yet even with these efforts, there was an undeniable sense that the situation had already moved beyond containment. The story was no longer confined to internal discussions. It was beginning to take on a life of its own, influenced by interpretation, speculation, and the growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Because what appeared to be a simple inheritance was quickly becoming something far more complicated and far more personal. At the heart of it all was Princess Charlotte of Wales, young, composed, and suddenly carrying the weight of a legacy she never asked for, yet one that seemed destined for her all along. What made this moment so profound was not just the revelation itself, but the quiet shift it created within her world, a shift that could not be undone once it began. Until now, Charlotte's place within the royal family had been understood in simple terms, defined by birth order and tradition, guided by structures that had existed long before her. But this was different. This was something deeper, something that reached beyond protocol and into the emotional core of what legacy truly meant. There was a growing awareness, subtle yet unmistakable, that her role was expanding in ways she could not fully articulate, but could certainly feel. It was not announced or explained. It was absorbed, piece by piece, through the reactions of those around her and the unspoken understanding that something significant had changed. The parallels between Charlotte and Diana, Princess of Wales, began to surface more frequently, not as direct comparisons but as echoes, reflections that carried emotional resonance. It was not about appearance or personality alone, but about presence, about the way attention seemed to find her, about the quiet intensity that surrounded her even in ordinary moments. For the public, this connection became a point of fascination, a narrative that felt both familiar and new at the same time. Interest grew steadily, fueled by the sense that history was not repeating itself, but evolving. And with that growing attention came a pressure that was impossible to ignore. Charlotte, still navigating the early stages of her life within the monarchy, found herself at the center of a story that extended far beyond her own experiences. Amid this rising intensity, Catherine, Princess of Wales remained a constant, her presence defined by quiet strength and careful guidance. She did not impose direction but offered it gently, creating a sense of stability in a moment that could easily have become overwhelming. Her approach was measured, protective without being restrictive, allowing Charlotte to grow into this new reality at her own pace. At the same time, Prince William, Prince of Wales's instincts became more visible, his actions reflecting a deep and unwavering desire to shield his daughter from the harsher edges of public scrutiny. There was a tension in that balance, between preparing Charlotte for what lay ahead and preserving the innocence that still defined her. It was not an easy path, and those closest to the family understood just how carefully it had to be navigated. The sapphire earrings, once simply part of a historic collection, had taken on a new meaning, one that was both symbolic and deeply personal. They were no longer just connected to the memory of Diana. They had become a representation of continuity, a link between generations that carried both honor and expectation. For Charlotte, this connection was not something she could set aside. It was becoming part of her identity, shaping how she was seen and, perhaps more importantly, how she would come to see herself. The burden of that expectation was not immediate or overwhelming, but it was present, a quiet weight that would grow over time. And as the world began to focus more closely on her, that weight would only become more defined, more inescapable. But as the world began to embrace this new chapter, one question lingered: why had this truth been hidden for so long? For decades, the truth remained untouched, locked away in records few could access and understood by even fewer, until circumstances forced it into the light. What had once been carefully preserved within the quiet discipline of royal tradition was never meant to surface so abruptly, and certainly not under such intense scrutiny. The secrecy surrounding the allocation of Diana, Princess of Wales's sapphire pieces, was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and rooted in a system that values timing as much as it does legacy. There were reasons, deeply embedded within the monarchy's unwritten codes, for why certain truths were held back, why certain decisions were allowed to remain dormant until the precise moment they could no longer be ignored. This was not about concealment for the sake of control, but about preservation, ensuring that what was passed on would be received with the understanding it deserved. At the center of this careful orchestration was the question of readiness. The idea that Princess Charlotte of Wales would one day become the focal point of such a legacy was never in doubt within certain circles, but the timing of that transition was always intended to be gradual. It was believed that age, maturity, and awareness needed to align before such a responsibility could be fully realized. This was not simply about inheritance, it was about identity, about allowing Charlotte to grow without the immediate weight of expectation pressing against her. The palace had long followed a tradition of delayed transitions, where legacies were revealed not at the moment they were decided, but at the moment they could be understood. In that sense, the secrecy served a purpose. It created space, a protective distance between the decision itself and the public narrative that would eventually form around it. There was also the matter of protection, not just of the legacy but of the individual at its center. Charlotte's early years were never meant to be overshadowed by such a powerful association, especially one tied so closely to Diana's enduring presence in public memory. To introduce that connection too soon would have risked shaping her identity before she had the chance to define it for herself. Those closest to the situation understood this risk, and their silence was not indifference but intention. Trusted insiders maintained that silence with precision, ensuring that even the smallest detail remained contained. Their role was not to question the decision but to uphold it, to preserve its integrity until the moment it was meant to be revealed. Yet within this carefully maintained structure, there were always differing perspectives. Not everyone agreed on how long the truth should remain hidden, or whether it should be revealed at all. Some believed that transparency would strengthen the narrative, while others feared that premature exposure could destabilize it. These internal disagreements never reached the surface, but they existed, shaping the way decisions were made and delayed. And as time moved forward, as external pressures increased and internal dynamics shifted, the balance that had once sustained this secrecy began to weaken. The moment eventually arrived when maintaining silence became more difficult than breaking it, when the truth, held back for so long, demanded recognition. It did not emerge all at once, but in fragments, each one adding to the growing sense that the story could no longer remain hidden. And once revealed, it set into motion a shift that would redefine how the royal legacy is carried forward. What once belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, was never just jewelry, it was a symbol. And now, that symbol was quietly passing into the hands of a new generation. The significance of those sapphire earrings had always extended far beyond their physical form, carrying with them a story shaped by emotion, resilience, and a connection that refused to fade with time. They were never simply part of a collection. They were a reflection of identity, of moments that defined an era, and of a presence that continues to influence the monarchy long after it was thought to have settled into history. And now, as that symbol begins to shift, it does so with a sense of inevitability that feels both powerful and deeply personal. At the center of this transition stands Princess Charlotte of Wales, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. Her role in this unfolding narrative is not about stepping into the past, but about carrying its meaning forward in a way that reflects the present. There is a quiet strength in that position, a sense of renewal that does not erase what came before, but builds upon it. The public, ever attuned to the emotional threads that connect generations, has begun to embrace this idea with a mixture of fascination and reverence. Media narratives have shifted, no longer focused solely on the revelation itself, but on what it represents. This is not just a story about inheritance. It is about continuity, about the way legacy evolves while maintaining its core essence. Guiding this transition with careful intention is Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose approach reflects both understanding and restraint. She does not push the narrative forward, but allows it to unfold naturally, ensuring that Charlotte's experience remains grounded despite the growing attention. Her presence provides a sense of stability, a reminder that even within moments of change, there is continuity in how the family navigates its responsibilities. Alongside her, Prince William, Prince of Wales, reinforces that stability. His role defined by a commitment to balance tradition with the demands of a modern monarchy. Together, they create a framework within which this transition can take place without losing its meaning or its integrity. The monarchy itself finds itself adapting in subtle but significant ways, responding to this moment not with resistance, but with a quiet acknowledgement that evolution is part of its survival. The sapphire earrings, once anchored firmly in the past, now serve as a bridge, connecting what was with what is yet to come. They carry the weight of history, but also the promise of renewal, embodying a continuity that transcends individual moments. For Charlotte, this connection is both an honor and a responsibility, one that will shape her journey in ways that are only beginning to emerge. And as this new chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that the story is far from complete. But even as the legacy finds its new bearer, the echoes of the past continue to shape what comes next. In the end, some legacies refuse to stay buried no matter how carefully they are protected. They find their way back into the light when the time is right. What began as a whisper, fragile and uncertain, had now come full circle, forming a connection that felt almost inevitable in its unfolding. The link between Diana, Princess of Wales, and Princess Charlotte of Wales was no longer something hidden in archives or preserved in silence. It had emerged, slowly but unmistakably, revealing a continuity that could not be dismissed as coincidence. This was not just about inheritance or tradition. It was about the enduring nature of legacy, the way it moves through time, reshaping itself while holding on to its core meaning. And in that moment of recognition, something shifted not just within the palace, but within the story itself. The palace, once cautious and restrained in its response, began to show signs of quiet acceptance. There was no formal acknowledgement, no defining statement that marked the transition. Instead, it unfolded through subtle changes, through the absence of denial, through the way conversations began to align rather than diverge. What had once been treated as a sensitive subject was now allowed to exist within the broader narrative, not highlighted, but no longer concealed. This shift was not sudden. It was gradual, deliberate, and reflective of an institution that understands the power of timing. Acceptance, in this context, was not about agreement. It was about recognition and acknowledgement that the story had reached a point where it could no longer be contained without consequence. Public perception followed a similar path, evolving from curiosity into something deeper, more reflective. What initially sparked intrigue began to transform into admiration, a sense that this connection carried meaning beyond its surface. The fascination surrounding Charlotte was no longer driven solely by novelty. It was rooted in the emotional resonance of what she represented. She was not simply a figure within the monarchy. She had become a symbol of continuity, a reminder that even within an institution defined by tradition, there is space for renewal. This shift in perception did not happen overnight. It built gradually, shaped by moments, by observations, by the quiet realization that something significant was taking place. For Charlotte, this transition was not marked by a single defining moment, but by a series of subtle shifts that collectively altered her position within the narrative. She stepped into this role not with declaration, but with presence, her influence growing not through action, but through meaning. There was a quiet power in that, a strength that did not demand attention, but naturally drew it. The connection to Diana, once an abstract idea, had become a defining element of her identity, shaping how she was seen and how she would come to be understood. It was not a burden in the traditional sense, but it carried weight, nonetheless a responsibility that would continue to evolve as she did. And through it all, the emotional connection to Diana remained as strong as ever, a thread that tied past to present in a way that felt both personal and universal. Her legacy, once thought to be fully realized, revealed new dimensions, new meanings that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. The monarchy, often perceived as unchanging, demonstrated its ability to adapt, to absorb these shifts without losing its essence. It is in this balance between preservation and evolution that its true strength lies. And as Charlotte's story continues to unfold, there is a sense that this is not an ending, but a beginning, one chapter closing quietly as another begins to take shape. Because in the world of royalty, legacy is never just inherited, it is revealed, one moment at a time. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.